It's weird to utter the phrase, heavy metal may be dying. Mainly because it feels so untrue. It feels like it could never ever happen. Music itself doesn't die. It's something that just sort of fades out of the prominent eye of society. If you consider ragtime music, how much ragtime music do you hear these days? Jazz and blues are starting to come back a little bit. They've always been kind of an element of music, but it's all been swallowed up by rock and roll and pop music and a lot of different other things. So to think that heavy metal, that heavy music is dying, sounds wrong, but there are some elements about heavy metal culture that definitely seem to be, if not kind of dying, but at least a little bit threatening. We're going to expose 5 of those things right here today. This is actually going to be part of a 2-part series, and that second video will come tomorrow, where we talk about why heavy metal truthfully is not dying, so definitely stay tuned for that. But let's talk about some of the reasons why it may be dying, or at least decaying a little bit. And number 5, the very first thing that we're going to talk about on the list, is the evolution of the internet and the diminishing of magazines and fanzines and different ways in which the music is being distributed, or at least talked about. See, back in the 1980s and even in the 1990s, and maybe some people still probably do this today, one of the most prominent things that you had was a lot of tape trading. You had a lot of people that were, swapping cassette tapes about, that would have different bands on them and different music on it to their friends or, to anybody who really, they wanted to have this music, and people were able to discover some new bands based around this. It was also based around some compilations and things like that that perhaps you got via magazine or perhaps something that you got whenever you picked up an album or something like that. There are many ways in which this stuff was being distributed around. Fanzines were something that were exceptionally popular. In fact, if you talk to a lot of the classic bands from the 1980s, you'll notice that a lot of the distribution of some of these acts, which actually led them to eventually get signed and become larger bands and become part of a larger movement, was based around this same idea. This was an idea that had been incorporated before from elements of, bands from the punk movement and the hard rock movement from the 1970s. This is not a new thing, by a long shot. But it was something that metal was able to use to further circulate the genre and actually give it a lot more in the way of legs. This is something that in today's society, where magazines are kind of out of date and kind of passé, have been replaced a lot more by tablet applications and, computerized forms of communication. Considering all of that, they're kind of passé and no longer used all of that often, which actually removes a very personal element to it. Whether it's a fan-related magazine, either that or something that is an actual publication that was going to a lot of different individuals, well, now you have to actually do a lot more searching by yourself and individually, and that can be a little bit difficult. Sure, there can be fans out there and other individuals that can provide you with a wealth of different bands to examine, but there will be some personal bias, and at the same time, perhaps also you're not getting the wide opinion of a grouping of individuals. Sure, you could just as easily start or join a Facebook group, or perhaps, read the comments of any popular heavy metal site in order to get that, but there's something about it that just doesn't feel the same. Number 4, the marketing. The marketing actually goes hand in hand with number 5, considering the fewer people that are, reading the magazines means, well, the fewer magazines that are out there. About 10 years ago, there was a magazine called Metal Maniacs that was absolutely fantastic. They were able to actually talk about more of the, at that time, a little bit more obscure names, or at least names that were within some of the subgenres of heavy metal that had not yet been illuminated here in America, perhaps to the same level of degree as some of the other things that were popular. This wasn't a magazine that was interested in what Killswitch Engage was doing, either that or As I Lay Dying. This was instead one that was more interested in the newer Mayhem albums, either that or what was happening with a band like Forgotten Tomb, or even anything of that variety. Isophirum, I think, was in there. In fact, if I could find the old Metal Maniacs magazine that I still have saved, I could showcase that for you. A lot of posters came with this as well. These are ones that you were able to kind of tear off and put on your wall. It was a great early way to get some posters of your favorite bands. I believe I have ones for Enthroned and Marduk. I believe I even may have gotten an Iron Maiden poster in there. Maybe that was Metal Edge. Metal Edge is a little bit more mainstream, so I'm going to aim toward that one. But this also hurts the marketing, principally because now the best way in order to see any sort of marketing for these bands will be either on a heavy metal website, their personal website, or if you're lucky enough to see it in a YouTube video, and that's pretty rare. YouTube video advertising is usually used to promote some bigger name artists, ones that have, the bigger pocketbooks. The marketing is definitely hurt, not only because of the fact that there's a lacking of different outlets, but also because the money just isn't there. Even though metal has certainly encountered a bit of a resurrection here within the past 10 to 15 years, one of the main reasons why it still feels like it's dying is because it still feels like there's still a lacking of exposure. It's something where if you're within the scene and you're with like-minded people, you almost are assaulted with a lot of heavy metal information, but whenever it comes to popular society, it's something that isn't there very much. I was surprised to find out that with the new Blind Guardian album coming out, that my store is going to be offering a patch. And that's awesome. I'm happy for that. I'm going to be very happy to have one. But at the same time, that's one of the very few and lone gifts with purchases that I've seen ever since perhaps the new At the Gates album, which I think you got custom guitar picks or something like that, or even the new Machine Head with the same idea. Number 3, the way in which the whole entirety of heavy metal is constructed right now, and I'm speaking specifically with the sound quality wars, as well as who's being promoted. The construction of heavy metal is supposed to be one that is very free form, one that doesn't exactly need to have a specific construct in order to really necessitate heavy metal. This is something where a band can go into the studio and do something completely off the wall, and there you go. It's heavy metal. These days it definitely feels like it's fallen victim to a little bit of that old bug where in order for a band to be taken on and actually get a decent-sized contract, one where they can actually tour the world a bit and get their name out there, that they really have to have a sound that's extremely marketable. This seems a little bit more like Business 101, because, you want to make sure your business succeeds. You're not going to take on a magnified risk just because. But heavy metal was kind of always the anti-convention. This was always the one where we would have labels that specifically would focus on heavy metal bands and give them the production and give them everything that they really required. The sound wars were supposed to also magnify the sound, make it bigger, louder, more destructive. But why is it then that the albums that were released in the 1980s and even the 1990s still are able to retain that furious, that frantic, that phenomenal sound that definitely feels like it spurned a little bit more of a revolution than these albums these days really seem to be doing? Well, I think the very simple fact is the fact that in spite of all that frantic nature, despite all of that, there was a movement that was not only going on, but it was a movement that had some serious backing behind it. People that were doing some real legwork. People that were actually willing to go out and put forward the effort in order to make sure that this genre not only stayed alive, but was one that was going to assault the world. It was going to assault eardrums everywhere, not just in your own fucking basement, but also your friend's fucking basement, your mom's fucking basement, perhaps your mother's boyfriend's ex-girlfriend's daughter's fucking basement while you're maybe fucking her. I don't know. That might be incest in some weird religion, but fuck it, who cares? This is something where you just have to realize that in spite of the fact that it didn't have the same sound quality as perhaps a Whitney Houston album from back then, a heavy metal album from 1990 still feels like it has a lot more meaning and a lot more weight carried behind it, simply because every note feels important. The songwriting definitely felt a lot tighter. And it's something where tight songwriting with phenomenal production does sound very pretty and very loud, but something about it just doesn't feel like metal. It doesn't feel like that From the Underground and Below, to steal an Overkill album title, approach. It doesn't feel like that do-it-yourself destruction that we were so used to. But maybe that's just me. Maybe one of the things that needs to really bring metal back like a phoenix from the ashes is really a strong, strong do-it-yourself idea. And that's something that's going to have to change within not only bands and producers, but also within the end users, the listeners. Number 2, the way in which the financial situation is handled, promotions, and also promoters. It's not necessarily all of that hard to set up a metal show, but whenever it comes to finances and things like that, you're going to have all sorts of problems. One thing that I believe a lot of the bands from before really understood is that you probably weren't going to eat for a couple of days. It's not a glamorous lifestyle. It's not one that definitely comes to you automatically. There's one thing that I've definitely noticed within this new information age within the past couple of years is the fact that, well, A lot of people are bellyaching over the fact that they're not millionaires already, even though they're in a band that is lucky if they sell out a crowd of 200 people and sells 4 records. This is definitely not a glamorous lifestyle, and there are definitely different ways in which you can get your music made and get it out there. But here's the thing. There's a lot of other people that are trying to get their music made and get it out there. So whenever you hook up with a lot of different individuals for these shows, there's going to be a division of the pot. There's going to be a pot that's also going to be reserved for the people who are putting on the shows. Depending on who that person is, you can encounter a pretty nice guy or a dick. And it's also something that has to do with the way in which the show is put together. Is it in a safe environment? Can you get enough people there? Are you willing to do the legwork? You can also throw legwork into this one as well. I feel as though there are a lot of lazy people out there that feel that their music should be what sells it for them whenever they have to do a little bit of selling themselves. If you make something, it's not going to get to everybody simply because you want it to. It's going to get to everybody because you have to put forth the effort. You have to actually hustle your ass. You may have to take a couple different jobs. You may have to do a couple things that you really don't want to do. And that includes maybe not eating for a couple of days. If you ever want to see really what it's all about, read biographies from people such as Dave Mustaine talking about how they were eating, bread, and, well, most of their money was going to habits of the illegal persuasion. Even still, they were able to make it through. Sure, it was a different time frame, and they had to deal with a lot of different people. But that's kind of my point. Don't think that this is the first generation where that shit's happened. This is something where a lot of people within the metal underground need to grow up a little bit. And these trials by fire are actually pretty good designs to see who actually has a chance and who doesn't. Who's going to be self-producing everything and hoping to God for a miracle, or who's going to actually go somewhere in this business and has the idea of sacrificing their mind to get there. But the number one reason why heavy metal might be dying, it's the music itself. It really is the music itself. You're looking at me right now like I have 12 heads. I know you are. I know you are. You're going to say to me, heavy metal is at its most diverse point right now. There is a boom of different material that is out there. And you know what? You're absolutely right. There is a boom that's out there. But think about the 4 things that we discussed prior to this. Think about especially how this is all being reached to the listeners, to the consumers. Consider how easy it supposedly is now to find heavy metal and how much that there really is. Where do you start? What do you listen to first? What do you go after? It seems like this would be so easy, not to mention also, it seems like it would be such a rich time to be in a heavy metal band. But it's not. It's oversaturated. It's something where 2 things have occurred, especially within the past 15 years. The scenes that have come forward are given way too much time to have prominence. Now I understand that thrash metal had a period of time that lasted roughly about 8 years, perhaps 9 if you really want to be technical, and had 2 waves. That's actually very strong for any sort of movement. Not to mention, it was one that did actually reach a saturation point at one point in time. Do you ever wonder why there's so many thrash metal bands that kind of come out of the woodwork a couple, 10 to 20 years later, and you wonder where the hell they've been, and you read something about them and realize that they were prominent in the 80s too, and you wondered why you never heard about them, why you haven't heard anything outside of perhaps the big 4 or big 8 of thrash, whether it's Teutonic thrash or just a North American thrash. There were a lot of bands. You ever wonder why grunge truly died? Was it because of the death of some high-profile members of the grunge movement? It was part of it, but it was also due to the fact that producers and record companies signed tons of bands that were marketing themselves as grunge just for that opportunity and fame. Oversaturation in grunge took place almost instantaneously. It was a scene that lasted only 3 to 4 years, but was able to kill the heavy metal momentum from the 1980s, from thrash metal, to the point where most individuals had no idea the boom and the explosion that was going on down in Florida or over in Europe. These scenes have been allowed way too much time. Metalcore, deathcore, you could say the same thing for the revival of thrash, or even the progressive movement that's going on right now. These are scenes that have been given too much time, considering metalcore is still supposedly going on. Considering deathcore is one where it's still being promoted as a big ticket item, but at the same time, the bands themselves are starting to shift out of the style a little bit. And the ones that are coming up in the supposed second wave were not actually second wave bands to begin with. They were bands from the first wave that didn't actually reach a peak point of popularity until the second wave. If you even want to call it a second wave, it's more like part B of the first wave. It's fucking confusing. It's ridiculous. These are bands that are incorporating styles that are actually oversimplified. Sure, you could have progressive deathcore. Sure, you could have progressive metalcore. You could have death metalcore. You could have black deathcore. There are all sorts of different ways that you can incorporate phrases into these things in order to incorporate them into the scene. But whenever it comes to prominence, it's just like nu metal. You wouldn't want a new metal album from, 17 years ago. You wouldn't want that here in 2015, principally because it wouldn't have the same effect as it did in the moment of time in which it reached its peak. But we still have bands from the nu metal department that are releasing albums. And of course, you're not going to see the same sales as you did whenever it was big. Just because everybody knows about a band doesn't mean that they're going to buy it. Just because a Korn album maybe comes out tomorrow, which it doesn't mean that it's going to instantaneously sell 2 million records. Just because Suicide Silence maybe releases a new album later this year doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have the potential to break through and go gold. This is what I'm talking about. The music itself has actually led to a little bit of the decay based around some of the other things that we've spoken about. Based around the fact that it's become an enterprise, it's become a business. It's not exactly the same way that it was 20 years ago. This is instead one where considering the promotion is not there in the way in which it was in years past, and considering it's a little bit more difficult to reach your end user, even though it should be so much the fuck easier, that it's actually stymied the growth of the genre. Growth that is there. Growth that exists. Growth that we will be speaking about in part 2 of this series. But growth that will always feel regional or territorial, or only relegated to those individuals that like that subgenre, or in some cases sub-subgenre of heavy metal. And that's it. There is not enough of a universality to this. People who liked Metallica and Megadeth probably also listened to Death in its earliest inceptions. Mainly because it did have a bit of a thrash metal base. There are some people out there that respect those same 2 bands, maybe even those same 3 bands, and also listen to Poison and Whitesnake. Even though there were a lot of territorial battles between thrash metal and glam metal. Especially in California. Probably over a lot of cocaine. Maybe not. But you understand my point. People are going to have their preferences, but also, it definitely seems like there's a lot more that can't reach these people. It seems like there's not as much encouragement out there. There's not as many reasons to actually get into this. Principally because that which is hyped to the moon feels like the same old shit. And that which is new and kind of different, that which actually has a little bit of substance behind it or has a rarefied charm, doesn't get anything at all. Instead of promoting the new Blind Guardian album, maybe we should talk about a new up-and-coming band. Perhaps we should have promoted the new Nia Bliviscaris album to the moon. But that's not going to happen. You go with the act that you know. You go with the one that has the reputation. That's just the way business is. But considering here we are, in an age where most people receive their information from a computer because they refuse to pick up a magazine, because they refuse to read, because they're more interested in updating their Twitter or their Facebook than seeing what's going on with perhaps some of their favorite bands or discovering a few new ones. We have this apathetic situation. Well, there you have it. 5 reasons why it may feel a little bit like heavy metal is dying. You probably hate me for this. The Wambulance is coming. Let's hop in. But don't worry. Don't fret. I have a couple reasons why heavy metal is alive and well. And those are coming for you tomorrow.